The black flags appeared overnight, hanging like dark shadows from every tower and window of Blackstone Palace. When the servants woke that morning, they found the entire fortress draped in mourning cloth, as if death itself had visited during the dark hours. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stared at the flags fluttering in the cold wind. She had worked in the palace kitchens for 20 years, and never once had mourning been declared without her knowing who had died. The nobles always gossiped, the servants always whispered. News traveled fast through the stone corridors, especially news of death. But this morning was different. This morning, nobody knew anything. "Did you hear about the king?" she asked Thomas, the head cook, as he entered the kitchen carrying a basket of bread. Thomas shook his head. "The king was fine yesterday evening. I served him his dinner myself. He ate well and even asked for extra wine." "The queen, then?" "I saw her this morning in the garden picking roses. She looked perfectly healthy." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. If not the king or queen, then who? The palace had declared mourning for someone important enough to drape the entire castle in black, yet no one seemed to know who had passed away. The mystery deepened when Sir Edmund, the palace guard captain, arrived in the kitchen looking confused and worried. His usually perfect uniform was wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Have either of you seen the royal family this morning?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "The queen was in the garden an hour ago," Thomas replied. "But we haven't seen the king or the prince." Sir Edmund ran his hand through his graying hair. "The mourning order came from the king himself, written in his own hand and sealed with his ring. But when I went to his chambers to ask who had died, the guards told me he wasn't receiving visitors. They said he was too grief-stricken to speak with anyone." Margaret and Thomas exchanged worried glances. The king was known for his strength and composure. Even when his own father had died years ago, he had remained calm and handled all the funeral arrangements personally. What could have happened to make him so overcome with grief that he couldn't face his own palace staff? "Maybe it's someone from another kingdom," Thomas suggested. "A relative we don't know about." But Sir Edmund shook his head. "The flags are flying at full mourning. That's only done for immediate family members or someone of the highest importance to the crown." As the day progressed, more strange details emerged. The palace priest, Father William, was seen carrying funeral preparations, but when asked who the service was for, he simply said he was following the king's orders. The royal musicians practiced funeral hymns, but they too had no idea who they were honoring. Lady Catherine, the Queen's closest friend and advisor, appeared in the great hall looking pale and shaken. She moved through the corridors like someone in a dream, responding to questions with vacant stares and mumbled words that made no sense. "She's been like this since dawn," whispered one of the Queen's maids to Margaret. "She keeps saying something about the letter, and it's too late. But she won't explain what she means." The afternoon brought even more confusion. A royal messenger arrived from the neighboring kingdom of Westport, offering condolences for the loss. But when Sir Edmund asked the messenger who had informed his king about the death, the man looked puzzled. "We received word this morning that someone important had died at Blackstone Palace," the messenger said. The message didn't specify who, just that mourning had been declared. We assumed it was proper to send our sympathies. Sir Edmund felt his stomach drop. Someone had sent word to other kingdoms about a death, but no one at the palace knew who had died. The situation was becoming more bizarre by the hour. As evening approached, the mystery took an even stranger turn. Princess Isabella, the king's youngest daughter, returned from her visit to the coastal provinces. When she saw the mourning flags, she rushed to the palace in tears, demanding to know who had passed away. But no one could tell her. "This is madness," she declared, standing in the great hall with tears streaming down her face. "How can we be in mourning if no one knows who died? Where is my father? Where is my brother?" The guards could only tell her what they had told everyone else. The king was too overcome with grief to receive visitors, and Prince Alexander had not been seen since the previous evening. That night, as the palace fell into an uneasy silence, Margaret lay in her small room beneath the kitchen and tried to make sense of the day's events. The mourning flags still hung outside her window, moving slowly in the night breeze like ghostly fingers. Somewhere in the palace, someone was dead or missing. But who? And why was everyone acting as if they knew something they clearly didn't? The king's grief was real. She had heard him sobbing through his chamber door when she passed by earlier. Lady Catherine's shock was genuine. The priest's preparations were serious and thorough. But how could an entire palace be mourning someone without knowing who that someone was? As Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring even more questions. The mystery was just beginning, and she had the unsettling sensation that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be more shocking than anyone could imagine. The black flags continued to wave in the darkness, mourning a death that existed but somehow didn't, for someone who was gone but couldn't be named. In the morning, the palace would wake to another day of questions without answers, and the strange mourning would continue for someone who remained a ghost in their own story. The second day of mourning began with an even deeper mystery. Margaret arrived in the kitchen before dawn and found a strange letter sitting on the preparation table. The paper was expensive, the kind used for royal correspondence, but it bore no seal or signature. The message was brief and unsettling. The dead walk among us, and the living have already departed. Look not for the body, but for the absence of the soul. Thomas discovered Margaret staring at the letter when he entered an hour later. He read it twice before setting it down with shaking hands. "Who would write such a thing?" he whispered. Before Margaret could answer, Sir Edmund burst through the kitchen doors. His face was white with panic, and his sword hung loosely at his side, as if he had forgotten to secure it properly. "Have either of you seen Prince Alexander?" he demanded. Margaret and Thomas shook their heads. The prince had not been seen since the mourning began, but everyone assumed he was grief-stricken like his father. "His chambers are empty," Sir Edmund continued, his voice cracking. "His bed hasn't been slept in for 2 nights. His clothes are missing, and his personal guards say they haven't seen him since the evening before the flags went up." The realization hit Margaret like a cold wave. "You think the mourning is for the prince?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Sir Edmund replied. "But if Prince Alexander is dead, where is his body? If he's alive, where has he gone? And why would the king declare mourning without telling anyone who died?" The mystery deepened when they discovered that Lady Catherine had locked herself in the Tower library and refused to come out. Through the thick wooden door, they could hear her crying and talking to herself in broken sentences. "It's all my fault," her voice echoed from within. "I should have stopped him. The letter warned us, but we didn't listen. Now he's gone, and we can't bring him back." Sir Edmund pounded on the door. "Lady Catherine, open this door immediately. We need to know what happened." But she only cried harder. "The letter came 3 days ago. 3 days. We had time to prevent this, but we failed. We all failed him." Princess Isabella joined them in the hallway, her face streaked with tears of frustration and fear. "What letter? What is she talking about? Someone needs to tell me what's happening in my own family." Father William appeared at the end of the corridor, carrying a small wooden box that looked like it might contain religious relics or funeral preparations. His usually calm face was troubled, and he walked with the slow, heavy steps of someone bearing a terrible burden. "Father," Princess Isabella called out, "you must know something. You've been preparing funeral rites for 2 days. Who are they for?" The priest stopped and looked at them with sad, tired eyes. "I wish I could tell you, child. But the king's orders were specific. I am to prepare for a funeral, but I am not to ask questions or seek details." He said the identity of the deceased would be revealed when the time was right. That makes no sense, Sir Edmund said. How can you prepare a funeral without knowing who died? Father William held up the wooden box. These are general preparations, blessings, prayers, ceremonial items that could be used for any member of the royal family. But I must admit, I have never been asked to prepare funeral rites in such a strange way. As they talked, a new voice joined the conversation. Dr. Harrison, the royal physician, emerged from a side corridor looking exhausted and confused. He had been the palace doctor for 30 years and had attended every birth and death in the royal family during that time. "Has anyone found a body?" he asked bluntly. "Because I've been asked to sign a death certificate, but no one has brought me a patient to examine. Dead or alive, I need to see someone before I can declare them deceased." The group stared at him in silence. A death certificate without a body. Funeral preparations without knowing who died. Mourning flags without a death announcement. The situation was becoming more impossible by the hour. "Dr. Harrison," Princess Isabella said slowly, "when did my father ask you to sign this certificate?" "Yesterday morning, right after the flags went up. He came to my chambers personally, which he's never done before. He looked terrible, pale, shaking, barely able to speak. He handed me a blank death certificate and told me to prepare it for signing, but he said I would receive the details later." "And you haven't heard from him since?" Dr. Harrison shook his head. "I've tried to see him several times, but the guards turned me away. They say he's too distraught to receive visitors, even his personal physician." Margaret, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "What if no one has actually died?" Everyone turned to look at her. The suggestion seemed impossible, yet it was the first thing anyone had said that might explain the strange circumstances. "Think about it," Margaret continued. "We have mourning flags, funeral preparations, and a death certificate, but we don't have a body. We don't even have confirmation that anyone is actually dead. What if something else happened? Something that made the king feel like someone had died even if they hadn't?" Sir Edmund considered this carefully. "You mean, like if Prince Alexander had run away? Or been kidnapped? Or worse," Thomas added quietly. "What if he's done something that makes him dead to his family, even if he's still breathing?" Princess Isabella gasped. "You think Alexander has disgraced the family somehow? That father has declared him dead to the crown?" It was a possibility that none of them wanted to consider, but it would explain many of the strange circumstances. A son who betrayed his family might be considered dead to them, even if he still lived. The king's grief would be real, the grief of losing a child not to death, but to shame or betrayal. But Lady Catherine's mysterious letter and her guilt suggested something even more complex was happening. Her words about having time to prevent something implied that whatever had occurred was not a sudden betrayal, but something that had been building for days. As the afternoon wore on, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. A stable boy mentioned that one of the royal horses had gone missing 2 nights ago. A guard reported seeing a figure in a dark cloak leaving the palace grounds around midnight on the same evening. The palace treasurer noticed that a significant amount of gold had been taken from the emergency funds. All of these clues pointed to someone leaving the palace in secret, taking money and transportation for a long journey. But they still didn't know if that person was alive or dead, innocent or guilty, victim or criminal. As evening fell on the 2nd day of mourning, the mystery had only deepened. Somewhere in the palace, the king mourned alone for someone whose fate remained unknown. Lady Catherine held secrets she refused to share. And the entire kingdom waited for answers to questions that seemed to have no solutions. The black flags continued to fly, mourning a loss that might not be a death at all, but something far more complicated and heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. On the 3rd morning of the strange mourning, the truth finally began to emerge, but it came in a way that no one expected. Margaret was preparing breakfast when she heard shouting from the courtyard. Through the kitchen window, she saw a lone rider approaching the palace gates. The horse was exhausted, its rider slumped forward as if barely able to stay in the saddle. Sir Edmund and his guards rushed to meet the stranger, and Margaret watched as they helped the figure down from the horse. Even from a distance, she could see that something was terribly wrong. The rider moved like someone who had ridden hard for days without rest. Within minutes, Sir Edmund was running toward the main palace, shouting for the king. For the first time in 3 days, the monarch emerged from his chambers. Margaret caught a glimpse of him through an upper window. His face was gaunt, his hair disheveled, and his clothes looked like he had worn them for days without changing. The rider was brought into the great hall, and word quickly spread through the palace that he carried news about Prince Alexander. Margaret, Thomas, and several other servants gathered near the hall's entrance, trying to hear what was being said inside. The stranger's voice was hoarse and exhausted, but his words carried clearly through the stone corridors. "Your Majesty, I bring word from the northern provinces. Prince Alexander. He lives, but barely." A collective gasp went up from everyone listening. The prince was alive, but something had clearly happened to him. 3 days ago, the messenger continued, the prince arrived at the monastery of St. Bartholomew near the border mountains. He was gravely injured and near death. The monks say he had been attacked by bandits on the road. They found him unconscious, with severe wounds to his head and chest. King Marcus's voice cracked as he spoke. Will he survive? The monks believe he will live, Your Majesty, but his injuries are serious. He has been unconscious since he arrived. They say it may be weeks before he fully recovers, and there's a possibility he may not remember what happened to him. Margaret felt her knees go weak. The mystery was finally becoming clear. Prince Alexander had left the palace secretly, probably for reasons they might never fully understand, and had been attacked on the road. The king had somehow learned of this and believed his son was dead. But how had the king known before the messenger arrived? The answer came when Lady Catherine finally emerged from the library tower. She looked terrible. Her hair was tangled, her dress wrinkled, and her eyes were red from days of crying. In her hands, she carried a letter that was clearly the source of her guilt and anguish. "Your Majesty," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I must confess my part in this tragedy." She held up the letter with trembling hands. 3 days ago, I received word from one of our spies in the northern provinces. The letter said that Prince Alexander had been found dead by bandits on the mountain road. I brought this news to you immediately, and you declared mourning for your son. King Marcus stared at her, his face showing confusion and growing hope. But the messenger says Alexander lives. How can both things be true? Lady Catherine began to cry again. The spy was wrong, Your Majesty. He saw the prince's body being carried into the monastery and assumed he was dead. He sent word immediately, not knowing that the prince still breathed. When the real news arrived today, it proves that our mourning was premature. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. For 3 days, the entire palace had been in mourning for someone who was actually alive. The king's grief had been real, believing his son was dead. Lady Catherine's guilt was justified. She had delivered what she thought was news of the prince's death. But questions still remained. Why had Prince Alexander left the palace in secret? Why had he taken money and traveled alone to the dangerous northern provinces? Princess Isabella stepped forward, her face showing both relief and continued worry. "Father, why did Alexander leave without telling anyone? Was he running away from something?" King Marcus looked older than his years as he sat down heavily on his throne. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the floor as if trying to decide what to reveal. Finally, he spoke. Your brother came to me 4 days ago with disturbing news. He had discovered that someone in our court was planning to assassinate him during the harvest festival next week. He had evidence, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. The room fell silent. An assassination plot against the prince would explain everything: his secret departure, his decision to take money and travel alone, even his choice to head toward the northern provinces where he might find sanctuary in the monasteries. Alexander wanted to leave the palace until we could identify the traitors, the king continued. He planned to travel to St. Bartholomew's monastery and send word when he arrived safely. When Lady Catherine brought news of his death, I believed the assassins had found him before he could reach safety. Sir Edmund stepped forward. Your Majesty, do we know who was planning this assassination? King Marcus shook his head. Alexander was still investigating when he left. He said he would send a full report once he was safely away from the palace. We may never know the truth now, especially if his injuries have affected his memory. Dr. Harrison, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. Your Majesty, with your permission, I would like to travel to the monastery immediately. Prince Alexander may need medical care beyond what the monks can provide. The king nodded gratefully. Yes, go at once. Take whatever supplies and assistance you need. Bring my son home safely. As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and continued unease. Prince Alexander was alive, which was wonderful news, but the assassination plot remained unresolved, and the prince's condition was still uncertain. Over the next few days, the mourning flags were quietly taken down and replaced with prayer banners, asking for the prince's recovery. The palace gradually returned to its normal routines, though everyone remained anxious for news from the northern monastery. Dr. Harrison returned 2 weeks later with better news than anyone had dared hope. Prince Alexander was conscious and recovering well. His memories were slowly returning, and he had been able to provide some information about the assassination plot. The would-be assassins were revealed to be foreign agents who had infiltrated the court, but they had fled when the prince's departure became known. The danger had passed, at least for now. Prince Alexander returned to the palace a month later, still weak but alive and grateful. The strange mourning period became a story that was told for years afterward, the time the palace mourned someone who wasn't actually dead. But for those who lived through it, the experience served as a reminder of how quickly tragedy could strike, how easily information could be misunderstood, and how precious life was when it seemed to hang in the balance. Margaret often thought about those 3 strange days when death had visited the palace without actually taking anyone. It had been a ghost mourning for a phantom death, but the emotions and fear had been entirely real. In the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that the possibility of loss was sometimes just as powerful as loss itself.